Imagina que você consegue sobreviver sozinho a um infortúnio da guerra. Você e seus amigos são capturados, mas você consegue escapar. E depois de tempos navegando, você encontra algo anormal que faz você estar sequestrado, preso em meio a uma guerra, ser muito melhor do que ver aquela criatura. Então hoje vamos jogar Dagon. Dagon é um dos grandes antigos, criados por H.P. Lovecraft. Normalmente você vai ouvir falar de Cthulhu, Chululu, sei lá como é que você vai falar, Yogi e alguns outros, mas o Dagon, ele tem embora ele seja um dos primeiros, a visibilidade dele não é tão grande como você pode notar nos jogos Eldritch Horror, Mansion of Madness, onde ele não é um dos principais. Inclusive no Eldritch Horror nem existe ele. O Arkham Horror eu não sei, ainda está lançando, quem sabe eles vão fazer. E como o primeiro vídeo deu errado, a gente vai começar um aqui, provavelmente com as mesmas zoeiras da primeira, que vocês não viram. Vamos lá. Dagon é uma fiel adaptação interativa da obra de H.P. Lovecraft, com foco na história e na atmosfera. Nesse jogo, você não vai se deparar com decisões difíceis, sequências de ação ou gestão de inventário, e a movimentação é limitada a passar pelos locais que compõem a trama.
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more.
Legal. Aqui a gente nota aqui, ó, como é que é o jogo. A gente vai jogar teclado e mouse. Aqui a gente vê a alimentação precária do personagem, como se ele estivesse se suicidando com comida ruim, né? Comida de gato aqui, comida de cachorro ali, sardinha.
Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below.
Assim, pela época, é bem simples imaginar, pela época e pelos dois negócios aqui na tela, que é uma seringa e um tubinho, que isso seja ópio, né, na forma de morfina.
Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death.
É aquilo, né? Quando você encontra um grande antigo, inclusive essa cabana aqui com esse papel de parede não ajuda muito, né? Mas sua mente teoricamente derrete. E é isso que a gente está vendo aqui, né? Aqui está a curiosidade da morfina. A morfina começou a ser usada no século XIX e foi rotineiramente administrada para o tratamento de dores agudas durante a Guerra Civil Americana, 1861-1865, e a Primeira Guerra Mundial, 1914-1918, que é esse daqui. E foi vendida até 1914 de boas. Morphium, associado ao Morfeu, né? Morfeu é um dos deuses gregos mais legais, né? Morfeu, se não me engano, ele aparece junto do Thanatos no certo disso? Acho que é no Cavaleiros do Zodíaco. Na época em que Dagon foi publicado, o abuso de morfina, conhecido como doença do soldado, já representava um grande problema nos Estados Unidos. E aqui é para continuar a história, tá bom?
It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation. so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners.
Pode apostar que essa justiça e consideração dignas de prisioneiros navais eram as piores possíveis, né? Aí você vê a ambientação aqui, é um cenário bonito, né? A questão de estar escuro, tanto atmosfericamente é bom, porque ele te dá um medinho, quanto essa questão de que você não precisa de detalhes em algumas cenas. As cenas seguintes, mesmo escuras, vão ter detalhes, que você vai ver melhor com o tempo. Mas aqui, não tem porque eu iluminar todo o negócio aqui, né? Os humanos foram nômades da Ásia Central. Quem não lembra, os humanos aparecem no Mulan da Disney, o desenho, não o live action. Bom, quem quiser, dá uma pausa aí. Eu vou prosseguir com a história para não ficar muito longo.
So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone, in a small boat, with water and provisions for a good length of time.
Aqui são as provisões. Cara, muito bem feito.
When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight.
Navegar assim é bem complicado, né?
The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know. For my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous.
Olha isso.
When at last I awoke, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished.
Cara, olha quanto tentáculos se movem de maneira absurda.
For there was in the air, and in the rotting soil, a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other, less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain.
Dagon, ele é o deus da pesca, né?
Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nausea. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet.
Cara, olha isso, nojo.
crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths.
Cara, provavelmente aquilo é um polvo gigante, mano. Que nojo. Olha. Cenário. Essas criaturas, mano.
So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, straining my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things.
Peixe.
For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time.
Cara, parece uma barata. Mas o cara é inteligente, deixar secar pra se mover.
That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert.
Aparentemente aquela ali. Cara, aqui você já começa a ver as criaturas fora do normal. Olha isso. Que bizarro. É frio ele, frio ele. Que triste. Cara, o pior é que o olho dessa baleia tá muito... Passa sentimento meio que...
That night, I encamped, and on the following day still travelled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it.
De novo viaja. Não posso esperar. Viaja.
By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. An intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again. And in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night.
E aí, pulo?
Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined.
Pra você ver como é que o medo preencheu a cabeça dele, né? Ele achou que ia ser um abismo sem fim,
Ledges
passou um
and
tempo ele viu que
outcroppings
dava
of
pra
rock
descer.
afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent,
Usa essa criatura aí.
whilst
também.
after a drop of only a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual.
Bora lá, então. Eu tô procurando informação, seja lá o que aparecer.
Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath.
Cara, é como se uma aura saísse dessa pedra estranha, mano. Olha. Não é possível.
Gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon.
Você vê, ó, do mesmo jeito que sai da lua, sai da pedra. O brilho.
That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature.
Assim, acho que a natureza não conseguiria fazer algo tão quadrado, né? Só de pedra, né? Porque o Bob Esponja
A closer
pra provar
scrutiny
isso.
filled me with sensations I cannot express. For despite its enormous magnitude, and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm,
Isso aqui tava aqui já.
and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books.
Cara, você vê aqui muita concha de um lado, muitas criaturas marinhas, principalmente tubarão, né? A gente tem o branco, cabeça de martelo, sei lá. E aqui no meio a gente vê como se fosse um quadro. No meio dele parece Cthulhu, mas ao mesmo tempo você vê outras criaturas marinhas. Talvez seja só um polvo.
Consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world.
Carai, se isso é ser marinho, não quero saber o que é isso do meio, hein?
But whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men. Though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto. Or paying homage at some monolithic shrine, which appeared to be under the waves as well.
Tipo esse que você tá, né, filho?
Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail.
Então, pelo que aparenta aqui, tem o rosto das criaturas ali. Só que ele tá meio que banindo isso na cabeça dele, por isso a gente só vê esse formato de
For the
pontinha.
mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips.
Mano, esse primeiro é feio, hein? O resto até é de boa de ver, mas esse primeiro...
Glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself.
Carai, o cara tem o tamanho de uma baleia.
I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then, suddenly, I saw it.
Cara, que suspense.
With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds.
Cara, que isso? Glitch.
I think I went mad then.
E com essa frase, acho que enlouquecer, a gente termina a primeira parte do jogo. Cara, que criatura maneira, que show de gráfico, de ambientação, cara, sensacional o cara que criou isso. Eu achei muito bom. Cara, sensacional mesmo. Isso aí.